Okay, great, thank you. My name is Catherine Au. I'm an environmental specialist at ICF. Joining me today are Rob Green from ICF, Danielle Shoup and Brendan Barrington from HUD's Office of Native American Programs, Chantal McKenzie and Brian Lesher from HUD's Office of Environment and Energy. And Brian is the Federal Historic Preservation Officer for HUD, so they'll all be around to answer questions throughout this presentation and after the presentation. Today's webinar is Advanced Section 106 Historic Preservation, Developing Programmatic Agreements, also known as Streamlining Environmental Reviews through Section 106 Programmatic Agreements. This is a continuation of a series of environmental review related webinars sponsored by HUD's Office of Native American Programs. The previous webinars are listed here and they're available online at the website below, and these are from the last 2 years. This is the second webinar from this year. Last week there was one hosted by HUD on using heroes to guide and streamline the environmental review process. In the spring, summer, and fall, we'll have more webinars. 3 of them will be related to endangered species, programmatic agreements, or other streamlining guidance. And then one will be related to floodplain management. So stay tuned, those will be later on in the year. Today's objectives are to briefly review the standard compliance process with the National Historic Preservation Act, specifically Section 106 compliance. Hopefully most of you are familiar with that process, but just in case. And then we'll introduce and discuss the use of Section 106 programmatic agreements, or PAs, for streamlining your environmental reviews. We'll discuss a few examples at the state and tribal level, and then outline the steps that you can take to develop a programmatic agreement yourself. Recap: National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, Section 106 of that act requires federal agencies to consider the impact of federal actions on historic properties, and the regulations are under 36 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 800. And so that highlighted portion basically says the same thing. The goal of consultation, or so the goal of Section 106 consultation, is to identify historic properties that potentially are affected by the undertaking or activity, assess its effects, and seek ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate any adverse effects on historic properties. In terms of the HUD environmental review, Section 106 compliance applies to all CEST, that's categorically excluded, subject to 58.5 reviews, and environmental assessments. The screenshots on top show what the form looks like, the 58.5 checklist where historic preservation is under, and then the 2 screenshots below are what it looks like in HEROES, the HUD environmental review online system. And then just a brief introduction to streamlining environmental reviews. Programmatic agreements, or PAs, are a way to streamline consultation in reviews, where you might have a default process to undergo consultation for every single project. PAs allow certain types of projects to bypass that consultation. The consulting parties, and we'll talk about who they are later on, they predetermine what effects a certain type of project could have on a resource, on a historic resource, and historic preservation can be streamlined this way. All right, so let's briefly go over the Section 106 process. I'll give you enough information to kind of walk you through just to jog your memory. So the flow chart of basic process. First, you define what your undertaking or activity is and define the area of potential effect. The undertaking is going to be your project activity, scope of work, any ground disturbance that could occur with your project. And the area of potential effect is the property address or boundary. That's most likely what's going to happen for most of your projects. It's just going to be project address, especially if you're doing a single-family rehab. If your property or building is located in a historic district, then that area of potential effect could expand beyond the project boundary or project address and encompass the whole historic district. Then you identify your potential consultation parties. By default, it's going to be your state or tribal historic preservation officer. And then if you're doing any ground disturbance, then you also might involve other tribes. And there are other parties too that we'll discuss as listed in the regulations. You want to determine the likely effect of your project. Most cases, especially with your rehab projects, you will have no historic properties affected. There are no historic properties involved in your project. And then more rarely, you'll have a no adverse effect or an adverse effect when there is a historic property or cultural resource involved. Then you'll want to send a letter to the potential consulting parties and ask them if they want to be involved in consultation or if they know of any historic properties or cultural resources. And then once you send those letters, there are 4 possible actions by those parties. They might not respond to you. They may ask for more information. They may ask to consult, or they respond with a letter saying that everything's fine, there's no historic property, we concur. If they don't respond, then you document that lack of response. Parties have 30 days from their receipt of the consult package to respond, not the date that you send the letter, but the date that they receive it. If they request more information, then you send them that information and the 30-day timeline starts all over again. If they request to consult because there is a historic property or a cultural resource at stake, there is no specific timeline. You just consult and work your way through that until an agreement is reached. And this can take months, 9 months to a year. Really depends on the complexity of the project and how many people are involved or how many stakeholders are involved. Most commonly, they'll respond with concurrence for your small projects, and you just document and file that letter in your environmental review. More information from the regulations on the definition of area of potential effect. That's the geographic area within which an undertaking may directly or indirectly cause changes in the character or use of historic properties. And it can change depending on the scale and nature of the undertaking and could be different for different types of effects. More from the regulations, 36 CFR Part 800, identifying historic properties. You should make an effort to screen beforehand as you're writing these letters whether there are any historic properties within your area of potential effect. Check the National Register, check other databases that you might have access to or that the state might give you access to. You'll seek information from consulting parties and other individuals or organizations who might know about any historic properties and get information from the tribe and other tribes. For consultation, so who do you consult with and when? Again, you're going to consult for all CEST or EA-level projects. You're going to consult with the State Historic Preservation Officer if you're on fee simple land, if your project is on fee simple land. You'll consult with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer if the tribe has one, if your project is on tribal land. If your project is on tribal land, but your tribe does not have a TIPO or Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, then you consult with both the SHPO and the tribe. Some tribes have cultural resource officers or offices or repatriation experts or other folks who have expertise in archaeology and cultural resources, but they don't have that TIPO designation. You still need to consult with the SHPO in that case to meet the requirements of Section 106. And then if your project involves any ground disturbance, you're also going to want to consult with other tribes that have a historic interest in the area. You'll send them a letter describing the project and project location. Typically, you'll include most of the following. It really depends on the region and the state and the tribe, but typically you'll want to include a map of the project and photos of the property. Include the year any structures were built, and then what your effect finding is. Is it no historic properties affected, or is there a historic property? Identifying consulting parties. I think I saw someone say who are the consulting parties. Again, by default, definitely your state or tribal historic preservation officer. You can also involve local governments, the tribe, and sometimes with certain projects, especially larger projects, individuals or organizations might send you a letter saying that they also request to be consulting parties. They don't need to be approved, but you definitely need to consider them and see if there's a legitimate basis for them to be a consulting party. Just a review, there's a HUD Tribal Directory Assessment tool called TDAT, website or database run by HUD. The website is listed below on the screen. And this tool can help you identify what tribes have a historic interest in your county. So on this website, you click on Search for Tribes, which is in green on the bottom right. And then a pop-up appears, and you have three options to search for tribes. By project address, you can select the name of a tribe, or you can select by state or county. I usually just select by state or county because the database gives you data at the county level. So even if you search by address, it's just going to map to that county and give you all the tribes with an interest in that county. And also some tribes, some reservations, depending on where you are, might not have typical addresses that fit this format. So I just find it easier to do state and county. In this example, I'm selecting South Dakota and Charles Mix County. And then I click on Submit Search. And I get 6 tribes that have expressed interest in consultation for projects in this county. If I click on the plus sign next to any of the names of the tribes, I get the contact information for the tribal leader and the tribal historic preservation officer or other related staff if they have one. And then I can also click on Export to Excel to get all this information in a spreadsheet, which might be easier to work with. Okay, so that's just a review of TDAT. Types of potential effects. Again, there's no historic properties affected when you don't have historic properties or resources in the area of potential effect, or if the type of activity won't affect any historic properties. And the wording here can be confusing. I have seen some SHPOs or TIPOs get this wording mixed up with no historic properties affected. But if you have a no adverse effect on historic properties, what that's supposed to mean is there is a historic property or archaeological resource, but the project will be modified to avoid adverse effects. Let's say you're working on a building in a historic district, so maybe you limit the rehab work to interior rehab that keeps all the historic fixtures in place, and so it still looks historic. You're just doing some minor interior rehab. Or if you have an archaeological resource and you're doing new construction, maybe you move the footprint to a different part of the site to avoid affecting those archaeological resources. And then adverse effect is when there is a historic property, but you are unable to completely avoid those, adversely affecting that resource. For example, if there were archaeological resources, but you had to dig them up and move them somewhere else, or in case of a historic building, you had to demolish it for redevelopment. Here's an example where they demolished a hotel and just put up a placard and a few steps to show that there was a historic building here in the past. Adverse effects require extensive consultation to mitigate that effect as much as possible and requires a memorandum of agreement among parties. Consultation outcomes. I showed this on the flowchart before, on the flowchart earlier. Again, you might receive a response saying that there's no historic properties affected. They might not respond. The SHPOs of the state, they will always respond. If you don't get a response from them, you need to contact them and make sure that they received your request. That can happen where, after 40 days, it's like, I haven't heard back from them. So then I email them or I call them and ask, hey, did you get my request for so-and-so project? And they might say, oh, I didn't. And so then you email it over or fax or send it over, and they'll usually try to expedite that. Or you'll receive a response asking for more information. They might want to see better photos, or they might want you to fill out an extra form if it's a property that's older than 45 years, depending on the state. Depending on your project, if you're doing new construction, they might want an archaeological survey. And so once you submit that additional documentation, that 30-day clock resets. And then if they want to consult, then there is a historic property or cultural resource that needs to be addressed. What does that mean for your HUD environmental reviews? Again, we're doing this for all of your CEST and EA-level environmental reviews. So preparing even a simple consultation letter, mailing it, and waiting for the response, that could take 30 to 45 days. If it takes you a week to get the letter put together and send it out, another 2 days for them to receive it, they respond 30 days later, and then it takes another 2 days. So yeah, you're already at 40 to 45 days. So the HUD environmental review, even for something like a single family rehab project, can take about 2 months to do. And it's important that you make sure you include all of the necessary information in your consultation package so that you reduce follow-up requests for more information, to not have that 30-day clock keep resetting, but just have that 30-day clock once. All right, so that was the recap of the Section 106 process. Just to see how you guys apply this to your own projects and environmental reviews. Let's say your project involves new construction of one house, including extension of the utility lines. What is the area of potential effect for this project? Is it A, the footprint of the house being built? B, the property boundaries or the parcel boundaries? C, the footprint of the infrastructure lines? D, both the footprint of the house and the footprint of the infrastructure lines? Or E, the property boundaries and the footprint of the infrastructure lines? Give you guys about 30 seconds to a minute to answer this. Okay, give folks another 10 seconds or so. We still have about 30 people who haven't taken a guess. And right now we've got a tie between two answers. So let's see if folks can break that tie. Okay, we can close the poll and see how folks did. Yeah, so it's been neck and neck between D and E. Most people realize that you do want to include the infrastructure lines as in your area of potential effect. The correct answer is E. It's going to be both the property boundaries and the infrastructure lines, the footprint. So even though you're not directly digging into all of the property boundaries or the entire parcel, by developing on the property where the footprint A is, in the future there could still be further work like that has implications on the rest of the property. So you always want to include the entire property in your project descriptions. Okay, well, that was neck and neck. Now let's move on to actually streamlining the environmental review process using Section 106 programmatic agreements. Again, streamlining tools, programmatic agreements are one of them. And they outline what types of activities will not have an effect on a resource. So in this case, historic properties. That basically defines when you need to do consultation and when you don't. It takes the guesswork out and leverages the historic preservation officer's expertise on historic preservation and reduces everyone's workload so that you don't need to send letters and they don't need to respond to those letters. And they can be negotiated between any of the following. It could be between HUD and the state, HUD and the TIPO, the tribe and the state, or the tribe and the TIPO. You can also include other tribes as well and other parties as appropriate. Again, by outlining what types of activities will not have an effect on historic properties or ecological cultural resources, you don't need to undergo further consultation for those activities, and that really speeds up the environmental review and lightens everyone's workload in the long run. Well, how do you develop one of these PAs? From the regulations, these are the steps. You invite the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation to participate. The Advisory Council is an office headquartered in Washington, D.C. They're a small office, but they handle all matters historic preservation related in terms of federal agencies and federal projects. And so there's a contact for all HUD projects for historic preservation, and so that's the person you'd probably contact. And when you invite them to participate, they won't always want to participate, but they will provide an answer within 15 days. You want to identify and involve other consulting parties, if you want to consult, or if you want the PA to be between you and the SHPO or you and the TIPO, identify them and involve them. Provide documentation, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide, and involve the public as necessary. Documentation, according to the regulations, so you want to provide, what are the activities that might occur. So a description of all the activities that you undergo with your programs and see which ones might be eligible for coverage under a programmatic agreement. You want a description of the actions taken to identify any historic properties and a list of such properties in your area. Description of possible effects on historic properties and adverse effects especially. And then any copies or summaries of any views provided by consulting parties or the public. We'll talk more about what that means practically later on. And then the Advisory Council website has a really useful section on drafting 106 agreements. And so let's take a look at that. Okay. And this website is really useful because it breaks down the different parts of a Section 106 agreement. Basically, there are 3 sections. You have a title, that's usually in bold, and it identifies what the activities are and who are the signatories. Also indicates whether the document is a memorandum of agreement or programmatic agreement. An MOA, that is for specific projects. Let's say you're doing new construction of 50 units and there is an archaeological resource on site and you have to figure out what to do with it. That would be resolved through a memorandum of agreement. What we're talking about today is a programmatic agreement where your tribe or tribally designated housing entity undertakes certain activities that you want covered under a programmatic agreement. And then the preamble is this introductory section that has all these whereas clauses, and I'll show you what that looks like later. It notes statutory authority for the undertaking, introduces signatories, provides relevant background facts, and any other contextual information. And then the body of the PA is called the stipulations. So what has the agency agreed to do following this agreement? So then, rule of thumb, whereas clauses are in the preamble and stipulations are, let's see, actually the whereas clauses are facts that exist at the time the agreement is executed, and stipulations are what the agency commits to ensuring are carried out in the future. And then there's some content checklist that spells out each section of the PA. So the title, preamble. This is pretty useful, so you know how to draft one of these. Stipulations. And there's a template memorandum of agreement that you can use for boilerplate language. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel and try to figure out all this legal language yourself. Monitoring and reporting, dispute resolution. These are pretty standard, and I'll show you where this appears in examples and drafts. Termination and amendment, if someone wants to change the agreement. Does the agreement expire? And then at the very end, there will be the actual signatures. So here's the guidance on drafting these documents. Let's show the template memorandum of agreement. And again, we want to do a programmatic agreement, so you can still use this template, but you would just change the language to tailor it to programmatic agreements. So the title, who's it between, regarding what's the activity. And then the first whereas, that's the preamble. So all of this whole section that has all these whereas clauses, that is the introductory preamble. So the activity consists of whatever your activities are. The tribe or TDHE has defined, well, this part probably isn't as relevant to programmatic agreements. We've consulted. And then the preamble always ends with now therefore. So therefore, the tribe or TDHE, it's usually the tribe, I think, and the SHPO or TIPO agree that the undertaking shall be implemented in accordance with the following stipulations. And then the body of the agreement says what the stipulations are. Here it's very short, but it really depends on what you guys negotiate. And then after that, you have other template sections that are standard for these types of agreements. So duration, is there an expiration date on this agreement? What are the procedures or protocols if we end up finding a historic property or cultural resource even after the environmental review? What happens and who's notified? Are there any monitoring and reporting requirements? If there's any dispute, how is that going to be resolved? And who's going to resolve it? What if further down the line you want to change this agreement? How do you change it? If you don't want to use this agreement anymore, how do you terminate it? And then signatories, so this is where everyone signs. So that's the template. Let me go back to the presentation. So here's a screenshot of that template. So, and someone asked if the abbreviation MOA can be changed to PA. So here was the memorandum of agreement template that we just looked at, and that's available on the website. And we should have a link to that somewhere. you would just change memorandum of agreement to programmatic agreement. And then anytime they say project or undertaking, you would replace that with a list of your programs or activities that you're applying the programmatic agreement to. So again, you can't completely use this template. You would still have to change a lot of language because one project is different from a whole program of activities, but hopefully you get the idea. Okay, let's go for another knowledge check. This one you have a 50-50 chance of getting it right because there's only two choices. So let's say you have an environmental review for rehab of a homeowner-occupied home. And under historic preservation, it says, no effect. This project involves only interior rehab of a home that is less than 45 years old. The project is in compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act. Is this language valid or sufficient? If HUD monitors your environmental review, are they going to be happy with this language? Okay, we'll give it another 20 seconds or so. Remember to hit submit when you answer the question so that we actually log your response. Okay, we have about almost 3/4 of folks responding. So we can close the poll and see how we did. So more people, about twice the amount of people chose yes, saying that this looks fine, and 18 people said no, this is wrong. And like this is an advanced class, so not everyone's going to get this right. The compliance determination here is not valid. It makes sense, but there are two logical gaps here. Again, for all CEST or EA projects, you need to demonstrate compliance with this. And the default process is going to be by consulting with the SHPO or the TIPO. There is no reference to consultation here. So I would ask, oh, why didn't you consult with the SHPO or the TIPO? The other answer could be that, well, they have a PA in place that covers projects that on homes that are less than 45 years old that involve only interior rehab. So if you have a PA, then you don't need to undergo TIPO or SHPO consultation, but there is no reference to the PA here either. So here in this documentation, they should either mention consultation with the SHPO or TIPO, or mention a PA and demonstrate that the project falls under the PA. Does that make sense? And again, this is an advanced topic, so don't feel bad if a lot of you are getting this wrong. This is definitely something that takes practice to understand and implement. All right, so let's move on to some case studies and look at actual programmatic agreements. The first one we'll look at is between a state and HUD. And in this case, it's Alaska, the Alaska SHPO. And HUD, this has been around for probably 7 or 8 years. And it's for HUD projects over the entire state of Alaska. And tribes can sign on to the PA to use it. And I'll show you how to do that in a moment. Following activities, this is not an exhaustive list. The exhaustive list is actually in the PA, and I'll show you that later. So the following activities would not require further consultation. Any rehab on homes or structures less than 45 years old, and certain types of interior and other rehab. There's also a stipulation that the tribe or responsible entity must send an annual report to the SHPO and advisory council on what projects it cleared through the PA. So that's kind of the summary of what the PA does, but let's actually look at it. And here's a link to that PA, and I'll share my screen again. Okay, so All this text in bold, in black, bold, and capitalized letters, that's going to be the title, as we saw from the drafting guidance. So the title is Programmatic Agreement among Alaska Tribes, Alaska Entitlement Communities, Alaska Department of Commerce, Community and Economic Development, Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, HUD, and the Alaska State Historic Preservation Office for the administration of certain HUD-funded activities. So we know that it's a programmatic agreement, we know who's involved, and we know what it's for, which is the administration of certain HUD-funded activities. That's the title, and then the next section is a preamble. So just kind of summary, I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but whereas HUD provides grant funding to Alaska and tribes and entitlement communities, whereas the tribe and other communities may now or in the future administer HUD grant programs, including the following. So you might recognize Lead-Based Paint Hazard Control Grant Program, NAHASDA, Indian Community Development Block Grant, Section 184. Whereas HUD under Part 58 allows other folks to assume the responsibilities for environmental review, whereas all of these folks have determined that certain activities funded by HUD have limited potential to affect historic properties and have consulted with the SHPO. Now, therefore, so that's going to be the end of the preamble. Now, therefore, they all agree that HUD programs shall be administered in accordance with this PA with all of the stipulations, including the appendices, to satisfy Section 106 responsibilities. Stipulations, they will ensure that the following stipulations are carried out. And so here's the important part. Well, it's all important, but here's the meat of it, the body. Activities listed in Appendix A have limited potential to affect historic properties and may be approved without further consultation with the SHPO, tribes, or advisory council. If the activity is not identified in Appendix A, then it must undergo the normal process, which is that consultation. And then every year they're going to reconsider that list of actions. And then the rest of this is that boilerplate language about discoveries and enforcing effects, monitoring, reporting. Here there's an annual reporting requirement. So the report will cover all activities that they funded and submit to both the SHPO, so the state, and the advisory council. And here's the address. And then more boilerplate stuff, training, how to amend this PA, how to terminate the PA, dispute resolution, duration. This was for a 5-year duration ending on the last day of 2020. And then they actually signed on to it again, or they renewed the agreement. So I think it goes on for another 5 years. And then all of the signatures by the parties who are named in the title. And then Appendix A. I used to keep a printout of this working on Alaska projects. Used to keep a printout of this on my desk for easy referral. So all of the activities listed below do not need to consult with Alaska SHPO or tribes or advisory council. So activities on buildings, structures, or facilities less than 45 years old, refinancing without any physical activities, rehab of older properties if they include only the following. So interior work such as electrical wiring, water and plumbing, heating and cooling, as long as they retain any historic features. Weatherization, so non-spray insulation, caulking and weather stripping, replacement of lighting systems, kitchen and bathroom fixtures or appliances, hardware such as deadbolts, door hinges, latches, locks, window latches, and stuff, fire detectors, repair of existing window, door, and porch screens and storm window or doors, certain types of upgrading, replacement, repairing of existing utility lines for infrastructure or sewer systems, some site improvements such as paving, repair, streets, driveways, parking lots. And so anything that's not covered in here, you would still need to consult with the SHPO. That would be, if you're replacing a window, replacing siding, replacing a roof, things like that, new construction. And then Appendix B, this is how any tribes in Alaska can sign on to this agreement. So they need to sign on to this and submit it to the SHPO to let them know that they've signed on to it, and then they're allowed to use this to cover projects that are covered here. Then Appendix C is that annual report that they have to submit to the state and the advisory council by March 31st of every year. And so they basically just need to list which homes they cleared through this programmatic agreement. And then the tribal leader needs to sign, and then they submit it to these two addresses. Okay, so that's an overview of a pretty well done programmatic agreement between a state and HUD. Next, we'll look at an example between a tribe and a SHPO. Won't name the tribe, but they've graciously allowed us to, or they've shared their agreement with us, so we can kind of look at it and see what it says. The programmatic agreement between the tribe and the SHPO. So whereas the housing authority, so the tribally designated housing entity, frequently undertakes activities that include the following: so acquisition, land banking, leasing, repair, rehab, etc. Whereas the SHPO and the tribe have determined that certain activities have limited potential to affect historic properties, and they've consulted with the state. So that's similar language to what was seen in the Alaska one. There are a couple of other whereas clauses that I'll skip, but now therefore the tribe and the SHPO agree that the HUD programs implemented by the TDHE shall be administered in accordance with the following to satisfy Section 106 responsibilities of the tribe. And then they'll talk about general exceptions, so you don't need to consult for refinancing, leasing, or acquisition when there's no rehab or demolition. And then there are specifically exempted undertakings. So in this sentence, they say the following specific undertakings on existing residential and non-residential buildings, structures, or facilities that are less than 45 years old are exempt. Units that are 50 years and older are not included in this programmatic agreement, and then including non-routine maintenance, demolition, and rehab, but not including new construction. This sentence is actually very confusing, and I'm actually not sure what happens to homes that are between 46 and 49 years old. So I would suggest, if you're drafting your own programmatic agreements, to keep it simple and not even include the last part, because that part of the sentence is actually, it's really confusing, and I'm not really quite sure what they're trying to say there. So let's just say the following undertakings on existing buildings, structures, or facilities that are less than 45 years old, and just leave it at that. And even the word exempt is not the best word to use, because it has so many connotations in other parts of environmental review and legal implications. So it's best to keep the language simpler. And so don't even say exempt, just say that, the following undertakings on buildings that are less than 45 years old do not need to undergo further SHPO review. Like, that would be so much simpler. And then, so it only applies to buildings that are less than 45 years, or buildings or facilities that are less than 45 years, if they are the following. So not everything that's 40, unlike the Alaska PA where anything under 45 years was included, this one only talks, this one you're only eligible if it's the following stuff. So site work, streets, driveways, alleys, parking areas, repair existing surfaces and parking areas if you're not enlarging anything, curbs, gutters, sidewalks, repair of existing things, site improvements, below ground or above ground utilities, And so these are pretty specific. Now, park and playground equipment, not including buildings. And then certain types of exterior rehab, foundations. With windows and doors, it's not even replacing the windows or doors, it's just repairing them. You can install exterior storm windows and doors with walls and siding. If you're using like material or similar construction material, then you can remove and replace them. Porch roofing. So you have to, read the fine print and see, okay, what is actually covered here? More examples of exterior rehab, mechanical systems. I would probably actually ask more about what they mean by mechanical systems and have them give more specific examples. Accessibility ramps, that's a common one. And then interior rehab. And here, again, they have mechanical systems, but they're more specific this time. So repair or replacing plumbing, heating, air conditioning, and ventilation, so your HVAC systems, electrical wiring, non-spray insulation, surface treatments. And then at the end of the PA, it's the same things that we saw in the template, in the guidance, and in the Alaska PA. So what happens when there's discoveries and unforeseen effects? How is dispute resolution to be handled? How to amend the PA, terminate the PA, expiration date of the PA, and who signed it. Okay, so looking at these examples, what can you do? What does that mean for you? We talked about under the regulations how to make your own PA, so let's kind of dig into that a little bit further. Who are you negotiating the PA with? If your projects mostly involve fee simple land, then you'll probably want to negotiate a PA with the SHPO. If your projects are on tribal land, but your tribe doesn't have a TIPO, then you would still want to talk with the SHPO first and figure out if there are any offices within the tribe that should also be involved. If your projects mostly involve tribal land and you do have a TIPO, then you can just negotiate directly with the TIPO. And if your projects and your programs involve a lot of ground disturbance, then you should probably even communicate with other tribes and other TIPOs and just see if you can clear that up front in a PA, and so that you don't need to contact them every time you dig in the ground. And then what activities do you include? So you send the consulting party, whether it's a TIPO or SHPO or tribe, you send them a list of the common activities that your housing division or TDHD engages in. Provide information on your housing stock. If you manage hundreds or thousands or dozens of housing stock, and of course that's different for everyone, provide information on it. Year built, architectural styles, features, modifications, photos. If you can clear your entire housing stock so that you don't need to consult with them anymore, they'll save you a lot of time in the future. And then through consultation, the SHPO or TIPO or consulting party, they might agree to a list of activities that would have no effect on historic properties, and the list is going to be different for everyone. As we saw, the Alaska one included all homes or buildings that were younger than 45 years, whereas the tribal one only included certain types of activities that were on structures younger than 45, and it didn't include any older homes. Work together to draft an agreement, and this process isn't going to happen overnight. It can take several months. Some tips, reminders, and best practices. So if you do have a PA, and even if you don't, you want to be more specific than just saying rehab when you describe your projects and your environmental reviews. Make sure that your scope of work matches what's listed in the PA if you're clearing the project using the PA. So like what we saw earlier, if you have on the checklist under historic preservation, you say, oh, our project is covered by this PA, or our project involves interior rehab. Make sure that it actually is. If you're doing new construction and it's not covered under the PA, then you can't use the PA. Or if you're doing exterior rehab on a home whether it's older, depending on the PA, if it's older or less than or younger than 45 years. If you're just doing exterior rehab that's not covered, then you can't use that PA. You still need to do that consultation. So make sure you're actually checking for the scope of work, see if it's covered in the PA for every project, especially for your homeowner occupied rehab projects. When your project does not fit within the scope, you'll need to consult. Another best practice or tip, this is for bigger projects that involve multiple funding sources. So if your project involves multiple funding agencies such as USDA, BIA, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, along with HUD funds, be sure to check with them if your PA can be used or if section consultation still must be pursued. At a minimum, a lot of other agencies require their own clearance, at least correspondence with the SHPO confirming the effects finding. So you might have a PA saying that, oh, this project doesn't need to undergo consultation. The other agency might still want to have a letter from the SHPO confirming that it still applies to their agency. And then if another grantee, responsible entity, or other organization already has a PA in place with the same SHPO, you can ask the SHPO about adopting it or adapting it to your program, so you don't need to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel. I'll share a link later of the Section 106 Programmatic Agreement database that HUD maintains. So you could take a look and browse and see what other cities or states in your area have on file with HUD or their SHPOs. And you can try to clear the same projects as they did. And so you don't need to start from scratch. And then, so let's say you do have a PA in place between the tribe and the SHPO. If your project involves ground disturbance, other tribes would still need to be consulted if you didn't explicitly clear that with the tribes in your programmatic agreement. And then also you want to discuss including common emergency repair activities, such as furnace replacement. One big issue we get in Indian country is, folks have emergency repair programs where they might replace a roof or replace a furnace or replace other type like HVAC system, which to folks in the community that's sort of an emergency repair where you need it before the storm comes in next week, right? Under normal circumstances, you have to do that 30-day consultation with the SHPO. But if you negotiate a PA, then you can clear those activities without undergoing further consultation. So that's something that you would consider. So that's how you get around having to consult on every project that you would consider an emergency. Other tips, keep the PA simple. Think about what your staff capacity is and what their expertise is. Make sure they understand scope of work and who's doing what. Make sure they understand what the language says. If you have high staff capacity, if your tribe has high capacity, okay, you can include more specific things. Otherwise, maybe just try to keep the language as easy as possible. Just a note, because HUD's mentioned seeing this in a lot of PAs between SHPOs and other responsible entities, is if you reference the Secretary of the Interior standards, know what that means and what you're agreeing to. Secretary of the Interior standards apply to rehab on historic properties. And usually there will be a memorandum of agreement saying we will conform to those standards when we rehab this very historic building. For your programmatic agreements, usually you're not involving historic property, and so you don't need to reference this at all. So that's just something to be aware of. If you don't know what it means, don't include it. One thing to consider, at least discussing with the consulting party, is maintenance. HUD does have a maintenance memo distinguishing between maintenance and rehab, and just make sure that you clear with your SHPO or TIPO that maintenance activities as defined by HUD don't need to undergo consultation, just to get that out of the way. It's really good and important to involve all appropriate parties at the start. You know, if you consult with the state and you've talked a couple of weeks or months, and then suddenly you realize, oh, we need to consult with an office with the tribe. And then you consult with them, and then they want to renegotiate a bunch of things that you guys have already discussed. So then that can really reset your timeline to another few months. So it's best to just involve everyone at the very beginning so you don't need to repeat discussions and use up more time. And then remember to follow any reporting requirements. As we saw with the Alaska PA, there's the annual reporting requirement where they had to send the Appendix C to the state and the Advisory Council by March every year. And so you want to include this or incorporate or integrate this into your environmental review policies and procedures, especially in case of staff turnover. You know, there's a lot of turnover going on in offices. If you lose your environmental review person and you hire someone else on, are they going to know, or how are they going to know to follow these reporting requirements as specified in these PAs? Okay, now very last thing, knowledge check. See how well we're integrating all this. Let's say your project is rehab of 10 homeowner occupied units, all between 20 and 40 years old, on fee simple land. No ground disturbance will occur. There's a PA in place stating that further SHPO review is unnecessary for rehab buildings that are less than 45 years old. So what do you do next for your environmental review? A, document that the homes meet the criteria to be covered by the PA, document the years built, and include a copy of the PA in the environmental review. B, consult with the SHPO because consultation is always required. Or C, consult with other tribes. The PA does not represent other tribes with a historic interest in the county. This one, you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting it right. And remember to hit the submit button after you select an answer so that your answer actually registers with us. Here you got 2/3 of people answering. Let's see if we can get a few more before we close the poll. Okay, we're at 73% completion, so let's close the poll and discuss the answer. 29 of you chose A, 7 of you chose B, and 11 of you chose C. This time the majority is right. The correct answer is A. This is a pretty simple project, and it's very common. I see this a lot in tribally designated housing entities where you're doing homeowner occupied units, rehab. Usually they're a little bit older homes, but let's say for some reason this was on younger homes. So they're all less than 45 years old on fee simple land. There's no ground disturbance. The PA covers rehab on homes that are less than 45 years. So according to the PA, rehab of these homes is covered. And then there's no ground disturbance, so there's no indication that you would need to consult with other tribes. So we don't need to worry about C. We don't need to consult with other tribes because if you're not doing ground disturbance, there's a very low likelihood that you would be disturbing anything that, or you wouldn't need to let them know, or that you wouldn't be disturbing any of their cultural resources. And then B is incorrect. Consultation is not always required. Compliance is always required. So Section 106 compliance is always required for CESTs and EAs. But when you have a PA, that's when you don't require consultation. So A is correct. The homes meet the criteria to be covered. You document the year built for each of those homes and just count and make sure it's younger than 45 years, and you include a copy of the PA for reference in the environmental review. Okay. So in conclusion, again, compliance is always required. Usually compliance is met through consultation, but a PA can streamline that process and let you bypass consultation for certain types of projects. It does require a lot of upfront work to negotiate that PA, and it might take several months and some frustration, but it can result in future efficiencies for your environmental reviews once you have one in place. So contact your SHPO and TIPO and HUD to ask about developing a program for or developing a PA for your housing programs. And then here's a list of the resources referenced today and some other ones. So on the HUD Exchange Environmental Review Historic Preservation Section 106 Agreements website, you'll get the Section 106 Agreements database, which shows existing PAs for all over the country, so you can peruse that for your region. HUD memo on Section 106 Agreements, HUD Advisory Council guidance, templates and documents. And then I also included a link to the HUD Exchange Ties Toolkit, which talks more about just streamlining environmental reviews in general. And let's break for questions. All right, Rob, what do we have for questions?
All right, so it looks like we have two questions, both from Sean Scruggs in the chat.
Okay. And could you read them? I need to find them.
Sure. So the first question, what is the legal capability of a PA to delegate SHPO authority to a federal agency?
Okay. Brian, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Catherine. And thank you for your question, Sean. As Catherine mentioned, I'm Brian Lusher. I'm HUD's Federal Preservation Officer. And related to your question, what is the legal capability of a PA to delegate SHPO authority to a federal agency? I'm not entirely sure what you're saying there. Do you have an example of what you're talking about?
Oh, yeah.
All right, because what I think you're asking is about the efficiencies that can be established in a programmatic agreement, and I think that what you're relating this to is something like the list of actions that no longer require a SHPO review. That's a simple example in that the lists that Catherine showed, those would be in the establishment of a programmatic agreement, a list of actions for which no further review is needed. And so related to the annual reporting requirement and the need to document satisfaction of compliance in the environmental review record, that could be a case where the federal agency or the responsible entity who is conducting the review and has established a programmatic agreement can avoid going to the SHPO or THPO for compliance for such actions, right? And the PA can also, as Catherine talked about, clarify the need to not consult for certain projects on properties that are not yet 50 years of age, which would normally require a review with the State Historic Preservation Office. And so I think that's what your question is about relative to the efficiencies that you can establish in a programmatic agreement that don't require going to the SHPO for every case. And I hope I've answered your question. If not, please please ask it again in a different way and with maybe a little bit more detail. And I'd be happy to go into some more detail on that.
Yeah, Sean, can you see if you can, or Sean, the host, can you see if you can unmute Sean, the person asking the question? And then there's another related question is, and Sean is a TIPO, I think. So his question is, what is the remedy if tribes don't agree with the PA other than not signing? In his experience, agencies will sign the PA, tribes will not, and then the executed PA will go forward, and the only remaining option is 106 consultation. So what's the recourse for tribes when they don't agree to a PA and then it gets signed anyway?
Well, in this case, I guess it would be interesting to know a little bit more about it, because in this case, was the tribe invited to be a consulting party, and were they part of the consultation that led to the development of the programmatic agreement? Because during the development of an agreement is when issues that might cause concern or controversy for a tribe can be discussed. And so if the tribe is, as the responsible entity, executing a programmatic agreement, then obviously any issues would be resolved prior to execution of it. But I wonder if you're talking about situations in which another federal agency or another responsibility may be developing a programmatic agreement and inviting consulting parties, including tribes, to consult. So related to that, really where those issues and if they are disagreements should be discussed is during the development of the PA as a consulting party, along with the other consulting parties that an agency or a responsible entity may have invited. And if a tribe chooses not to sign, I think this question relates to, again, a tribe as a consulting party, because if a tribe is executing the programmatic agreement, having taken on the environmental review responsibilities under Part 58, then issues they have during the consultation would, needless to say, be ironed out prior to signature. But I think you may be talking about a scenario in which a tribe was invited to be a consulting party, and during the development of the PA is when issues like that should be discussed and hopefully resolved to the satisfaction of the signatories and the consulting parties, such that the consulting parties feel comfortable participating in the programmatic agreement going forward.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. Excuse me, Sean Scrouts Manahu. It's hello, I'm Paiute. I'm the Tribal Historical Preservation Officer for the Fort Independence Indian Tribe in Eastern California. Thank you for taking my questions. So I'd like to expand just quickly. Thank you for unmuting me, and I'll try to get to this quickly. And if it's beyond the scope of this conversation, I would definitely appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you and Catherine in another possible shorter meeting to discuss this. But currently, I've worked on 2 large programmatic agreements in the recent past. But the most current one that I'm in is with in California, in Eastern California. There are 7 tribes that are currently working with Inyo Forest. And Inyo Forest is developing, they're in their Region 5 programmatic agreement process. They've asked for comments, and unfortunately for many tribes, because of capacity and some gaps in specific, training and legalities, sometimes the tribes don't know where to hone in on the PA. But I'm sitting here looking at, and I'm going to read just one little portion from here, and it says, so the Inyo Forest has a position, an archaeologist whose title is Heritage Program Manager, and their job basically is they're an archaeologist, so they're supposed to have the expertise on 58,000 acres, actually more of the forest. So it says the Heritage Program Manager, without formal SHPO consultation, determines areas of potential effects certifies determinations of NRHP eligibility as provided with this PA and determines no adverse effects or no historic properties affected by an undertaking. So that to me delegates where a heritage program manager then is assuming the full authority of the SHPO and then gets to determine, it specifically says no adverse effect on totally more than 100,000 acres. And there's no mention of TIPO or tribal involvement in this particular section. And that's where I asked the one question, what I've seen in a lot of these examples of really large complex PAs is that SHPO, and I've even seen one where, and I've worked on a project where federal highways delegated all of their authority, federal authority, to a state agency. And in this case, the state is giving Inyo Forest, we're going to assume that Inyo Forest, without any consultation, and this one manager can then make a decision of no adverse effects on the immediate 58,000 acres that we're working on. And this place has been a place of common affiliated use for 7 tribes since the beginning of time. And from
let me jump in there, Sean.
Yeah.
It does sound questionable, I agree with your questions. I see your concerns, and thank you for sharing your contact information. I'll pass that on to Brian. But it sounds like these are not HUD projects, so it's almost hard to know where HUD would fit in, but that's something I think you would want to involve the advisory council on. Sorry, you want to involve the advisory council and make them aware of these issues. And I think this is beyond the scope of HUD PAs, if that makes sense, but I will share your information with Brian and have you guys follow up. But thank you so much for your examples.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't realize this was HUD specific. That adds to my confusion. I was just forwarded this from another person to attend, but they're always great meetings. And yes, if you can please follow up, and if you don't have the answer specifically, if you can help me find, so I was at ACHP in Washington, DC back in June to attend the in-person class, and I'm starting to find out who to contact and get better information. So I really appreciate a follow-up email or conversation where we can find resources to help kind of address these larger questions. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Sean. And thank you, Catherine. I really appreciate that. And Sean would be more than happy to discuss this with you just in terms of Section 106 writ large, but also might want to refer you back to the advisory council. But, just briefly, in this case where an individual, I'm assuming, may be acting as federal agency in the Section 106 regs, it is the agency's determination. The agency leads the process. And so in that sense, the agency develops the APE, they develop a list of historic properties, they develop a finding of effect, but that's all done in consultation and with an ability to comment. And so there should be a place in this process for comments and thoughts and notions on historic property identification, as well as even potential effect in the consultation process. And so I appreciate your question, and we could certainly talk more about this offline.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that opportunity, Brian and Catherine. Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys. Next question. Why did the question about affected area not include utility lines outside the property boundary and only the property boundary, unless I looked at the map wrong? So I want to just go back to that slide real quickly. It does include the utility lines, and this is a very rudimentary drawing or sketch. Yes, it does include the infrastructure lines outside the property. So your area of potential effect is not limited to your property boundaries in this case. Hopefully that makes sense.
Catherine, may I actually interject on that real quick from a TIPO perspective?
Okay.
So what I'm finding a lot of agencies want to do, and they covered this in ACHP 106 course, but in my experience and what we're finding is that, for instance, a utility line, and this is what we're finding with Greenlink West, which is a huge transmission line, and another transmission line that's 458 miles. There's a couple complexities. So number one, people just in general don't realize that most of the infrastructure that's been built in the United States was built without tribal consultation ever. And so many places it may look like, oh, there's an infrastructure built or an existing road, but they don't realize that might have already destroyed a site, or that our cultural footprint has already been erased, so to speak, because indicators have been taken away. So there's this propensity for most people to think that no consultation or consultations already taken in place in the past. And so moving forward, what I do as a TIPO is I tell everybody that tribal monitors are necessary, that a tribal consultation is, because very few people without the history or knowledge can't know how tribal folks use that land prior to tax. So there's a need to really carefully examine any areas that construction workers might work, equipment might disturb or destroy unknown sites, or once they dig into the ground or cause any additional work, these may be inadvertent discoveries, which is human remains, or desecration of other sites that are important to tribal folks. And it's just a quick reason why those other areas would be considered, because some kind of ground disturbance will likely take place.
Yeah, no, very true. And thank you for that, sharing that with the tribal monitors and everything. So, what you're saying in that example is, even if you're doing work in an existing utility trench line, the tribe might still want tribal monitors to be on hand just to see, if there might have been things that were overlooked in the past. So, yeah, thank you for that. This question is for Brian. Have you seen any PAs that include sustainable infrastructure or energy efficient buildings or rehabs, and how would that be documented?
I cannot think of any off the top of my head that I've seen lately, but it is certainly something that we're seeing more and more. HUD, for instance, has a large push for energy efficiency, as well as issues related to climate change. Many other federal agencies do, and the topics would be incorporated in any such PAs that have been executed. And so Catherine's done such a good job of showing the framework and the structure of a programmatic agreement, as well as a couple of examples. And your question points to the fact that PAs can address almost anything. I mean, they can address a whole wide range of spectrum of issues and undertakings related to federal funding and federal assistance. And it is certainly a growing area of concern. For instance, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation that Catherine mentioned has recently issued a climate change and historic preservation policy statement that is on the Advisory Council's website. It's a really interesting read because it is applying historic preservation thought and practice and compliance with the complexities and challenges we're seeing with climate change these days, and recognizing that many historic properties are under threat related to the effects of climate change. So I'm sorry I don't have a particular example to share with you, but it's a growing area of concern within historic preservation, and certainly something that could be incorporated into programmatic agreement related to any funding or assistance from the federal government. But excellent question, because it is certainly a growing area.
And then sort of related, and this might be more of a question for Danielle, but I'll try to answer it and then see if anyone else has anything to add. How can an eco-building company who wants to be involved and of service to tribal organizations get in touch? This person is a master plumber general contractor and runs an eco-building company and has experience with contracts. So I'm not sure what type of level of involvement you're referring to, but in terms of getting in touch with tribal organizations, there's the National American Indian Housing Consortium, NAIHC. That would be a great place to start for contacts. For HUD contacts, on this website, the HUD Exchange website, you can contact the HUD environmental staff, where you can find Brian and Danielle's contact. Danielle, any ideas on how folks can be connected? let's see, do we still have Danielle? Oh, I think Daniel might have dropped. Yeah, so I'd say probably start with different housing consortiums, with especially NAIHC, the National American Indian Housing Consortium, be a great place to network and add services. Okay, any other questions before we end? Thank you everyone for your participation. It's been a great turnout, and stay tuned for future webinars.